Hey guys, thank you very much for pressing play on today's show. I think you're really going to love it because, of course, I've got Kenneth C. Davis talking about the history of Independence Day, and writer, journalist, author Mike Grunwald joins me to talk about his new podcast about eating for the climate, which he co-hosts with the great Tamar Haspel of the Washington Post. Really, really great. Both interviews are awesome. I'm very excited to share them with you here on my quote, working vacation. You know, someday I'm going to take a break where I don't work on vacation at all and just pre-record all these interviews and share them with you ahead of time. But that is not this week. So it might not be up on time the way I want it to, but it is here for you. And I am so grateful to you for listening. I know there's a zillion podcasts out there. The fact that you're listening to this one and hopefully are thinking about or already a member of the stand-up community means everything to me. If you aren't, join us. I probably won't be doing tonight's hangout because I don't know where I am going to be. I just haven't even figured out my plan. I'm coming at you right now from the National Conservation Training Center in West Virginia, Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where last night I did a speaking engagement with tribal youth, and it was as it always is. I think this is the 5th or 6th time I've done it. Absolutely amazing. I am here as part of the Native Youth Climate Adaptation Leadership Congress, and I've been coming down here for about 10 years. The great Steve Chase, who is the director here, has become a good friend of mine, introduced me to these amazing organizations, and I come down and facilitate talks and workshops and always have a great time. So really happy to be doing that and to be happy with some of my old friends. Being with my old friends. If you want to learn more about what they're doing here, go to nycalc.org and support this initiative. It's just amazing. So let me get to my interviews, and let me thank you again for listening, but I think you're really going to like it. Kenneth C. Davis coming up. But first, I've got Mike Grunwald. Michael Grunwald is an author, an award-winning author and journalist who writes about national politics and public policy. He used to be at the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Politico Magazine. He's the author of several books, including The Swamp, The Everglades, Florida, and the Politics of Paradise, and The New Deal, The Hidden History of Change in the Obama Era, which is a really, really important book. Right now, he's working on a new book about food, land, and climate change. But today we talked about his new podcast called Climavores, a show about eating for a changing planet. We all know food is a big deal for the planet, but it's not always obvious what we should eat if we want to make things better. And that's exactly what Tamar Haspel and Mike Grunwald are doing, co-hosting this new podcast exploring the relationship between food and the environment. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Grunwald, and you can learn more about their podcast, but go listen, Climavores. I love promoting podcasts of people I like, my friends, and this is no exception. I think you're really going to like this, and you're going to love my conversation with Mike. Here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest journalists of our time, of my time, of his time, Mike Grunwald joins me now to talk about this new podcast, which you all must listen to, Climavores. It's great to see you, my old friend.
Thanks so much, Pete. I love being on your show. As your listeners know, you're amazing. I'm gonna learn from you. You're gonna have to tell me how to do this.
Well, you sent me this information in a direct message, and you said doing this podcast with Tamar Haspel, who, if you don't know her, she's amazing. She writes about food and all of this stuff, climate sustainability in the Washington Post, right? I mean, she's great. I've followed her for a long time, and you said, and I'm going to steal most of your audience, which I thought was mean, and we can share them, Mike. They'll love what you're doing.
I don't recall that, Pete. I think we're gonna have to read that back. I think
you would never say such a thing.
But if your audience is so inclined, then hey, sorry.
My point is, if you like what I've always invited Mike on every article I see of his, tweets even, and of course his books, and I talk to Mike every week. So you get to listen to the podcast every week. Each week, a show about eating on a changing planet. You're writing a new book that you've been working on that you told me about this to some extent as well. So what gives you the credibility? What gives Tamar the credibility to host a show like Climavores?
Well, exactly. I think I didn't have it, which is why I recruited Tamar to do it with me. I've been writing about, I've been a journalist for, since the Holocene era. And I've been writing about climate for, more than a decade. But I was an energy guy. I wrote, I wrote a book about Obama that had a ton about the sort of clean energy revolution. And I've really been obsessed. I had a column about energy at Time Magazine for a while, and I've really been obsessed with, that sort of part of the climate story. And it was really a few years ago. I think I even talked to you about this story on your show. I wrote a magazine piece for Politico Magazine about my own green life, about how I had gotten solar panels and an all-electric Chevy Bolt. And in it, I had a throwaway line about how I wasn't really that green a guy. I don't line dry my laundry. I don't unplug my computer at night. I'm not a vegan. And while I was writing it, I was like, wait a minute. Is going vegan even good for the climate? Like, I was a climate reporter and I didn't know that. And sort of, spoiler alert, yes, it is good. But I should have known. That was sort of the beginning of my journey into realizing that, hey, there's this gigantic white space. There are hundreds of books about fossil fuels, and it's very important. Fossil fuels are very bad, and they're great books. But nobody had looked into the food system part of climate, which is a third of our emissions. So that was sort of the beginning of my obsession. But I realized as a sort of newbie to food, I needed to have a partner. And originally, the guys at Postscript Media had suggested, you should find a chef. You should find somebody who's really in the food world. But I really wanted this to be about facts and, really about journalism. And I happened to be reading Tamar's amazing book about her experience with firsthand food. She has an oyster farm. She has a garden. She raises chickens. It's and it's funny. And so I'm reading it, and I was like, oh, of course. So we had never actually spoken in real life, but I called her, and within a week, I think we had a deal. It was just I think it's really a perfect. She knows so much about the nutrition side, the culture side of food. I'm more just the pure climate dork. But it's, I don't know, maybe it's just because it's like two middle-aged Jews talking, but I think it's,
I wasn't going to say it, but you said it. And that might be one reason. It might be one reason why there's so much charisma. Because I listened to episode 1, which I loved, and you can even hear it in the preview. I mean, Tamar's, great. You guys are hilarious together and really interesting. So that's hard to find. People get put together on podcasts like this sometimes, but it's great. You guys, it seems like you're old friends. Is Climavores, is that your word?
So it's funny.
It's amazing.
We were desperately trying to figure out a name. We were thinking of table stakes, and then it turned out like Heinz had it for their like in-house podcast. We're like, okay, we're not gonna do that. Carbonara was an idea.
I like it. I like
not
it.
Bad. But I saw an article about, there's locavores, right? People who eat local. I saw a kind of trend article about climavores, people who eat for the climate. And so I said, we could do this. And Tamar immediately despised it. He was like, no, we're not doing that. Because she hates locavores as a word because, right. It sort of pigeonholes people and it makes it sound like just like people who eat local. It's all about eating local. And Climavores makes it sound like all we care about is the climate. And it's not all we care about. Maybe it's all I care about. But, food is a very expansive issue. But anyway, she got, the bosses talked her into it.
Well, it's great. I mean, I think it's a perfect name for the podcast because of what you talk about. For example, episode 1 is, I think, probably the most important question that you can begin to answer, and you only did 30 minutes. I could have listened to 5 hours of this because there's certainly a lot there. Why eating for climate is so complicated. So give us a little preview of that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you guys hope to achieve on this weekly. Right, weekly you'll drop every week.
It's going to be weekly. And look, I think we don't delude ourselves. I think when people eat, the things they care about the most are how it tastes, what it costs, and is it convenient, right? Like, we want our like Go-Gurt that we can, eat in the car, right?
Awful.
And then after that, we care about, whether it's good for our bodies, which as you know, Tamar has done so much work on, like, we don't know shit about what's good for our bodies. Like, you know, sugar is bad, carbs make you fat. But really, it's like there's a lot of kind of sketchy science. But look, some people do care about the climate. And one thing so I don't feel like super strongly like, oh, you need to be a vegan. I'm not a vegan. But I think if you care about the climate, it's good to, you know, take that into account when you eat. And what I do feel strongly about is that most people have no idea what's good for the climate when they eat. I think there's so much misinformation. And then there's just a lot of kind of lazy ideological assumptions, which Tamar always yells at me because it sounds like I'm sneering. But remember, like 4 years ago, I had no idea about any of this stuff.
Yeah, that's what makes it great too. That there's that. You know,
like I just think like we're busy people. We don't like study the emissions impact of what we eat. Right. It's you know. But that's sort of why God invented journalists, right? So the idea is that hopefully we can talk through this stuff, you know, help people think about it. And in a way, like using food as a way to sort of think through the climate crisis. Because again, you know, none of us are perfect. You know, I like to say that we all find the level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with. Yeah. But, you know, better is better than worse. And, you know, facts is better than lazy assumptions. So, you know, that's kind of our starting point.
I love that level of hypocrisy that we're comfortable with. I'm writing that one down.
Religion, you know?
Yeah, well, yeah, like a lot of different elements and choices that we make. Climavores, if you're not listening to it, you got to go subscribe to it. A show about eating on a changing planet. Each week, journalists Tamar Haspel and Mike Grunwald explore the complicated, confusing, and surprising relationship between food and the environment. You also take questions from your audience, which is great. And one of the questions asked, and it's an important one, an interesting one, is, well, how much energy does it take to grow a cornfield or a soy field versus, you know, 70 head of cattle? And you know, if I want to feel better about eating animals and not kale all the time, it's, you know, a lot of energy. Kale is energy intensive. How do we calculate these things? Is there even a formula that works?
I mean, you know, not to give away our third episode, which is about beef. But yeah, I mean, there are formulas, and beef is worse. Like, you know, sorry, like I don't like kale, but if like we could eat kale all day, that would be a lot better for the climate. You know, I think Tamar does talk incessantly about lentils. I don't know what to say, but unfortunately, lentils are really good for the climate as well. You know,
did a lentil hurt you when you were a child? What is this?
You know, I mean, I'm probably giving away like it'll be like episode 9, but because of Tamar, I've started eating lentils. And they're actually good. I hate to admit it. I was sort of using it as a punchline, but you know, I guess, you know, just between you and me and your bazillion listeners, yeah, lentils are good. So but look, from a climate perspective, beef is really bad, and the reason, you know, it's pretty. People talk. It's true. Like the manure is bad. The burps and farts, which I know, like a lot of climate deniers, like they like to point to that to make kind of climate sound like a silly issue, but those are bad. But the real reason that beef is bad is because we use 2/3 of the world's agricultural land to graze cattle, or to, you know, grow grain that we feed to cattle, and that's a disaster. That's why we have so much deforestation, and so again, like I've dramatically reduced my beef intake. But beef is delicious, and I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. So it's a hard problem. I think the one thing that's changed, probably the best thing that's happened to the climate in America over the last 50 years has been the gradual shift in our diets from beef to chicken, and it's because, you know, industrial chicken, they treat chickens horribly. They treat workers horribly. They even treat farmers horribly. There are all kinds of terrible things about it, bad for the environment. But it turns out to be only mediocre for the climate, while beef is terrible for the climate. And so that shift has really made a difference. So again, Tamar always says food is trade-offs. And that's what we try to talk through.
So important. All these issues are so important. I mean, you make so many decisions. I think I read this somewhere in either the description or maybe on the podcast about what you're going to eat, from the purchase, the whole chain of custody, and then your demand plays out in the market. So if you're always buying raspberries, well, a lot of other people are as well. And they that's my weakness. And I think they grow them in Mexico or even in California, and they got to cart them all the way over to my ass, which is why, of course, Mike, I've got a huge, I'm looking at them right now, patch. I've got bushes upon bushes, bushels upon bushels of raspberries. And you know how long that feeds my family? A week, even when you freeze them. It's not enough for our consumption. So even that, like the chain of custody and the energy that it takes to get a raspberry, and then the packaging, you'll talk about all those things too, I'm sure.
No, that's right. It's funny that you mentioned those raspberries, because our second episode is about local food, which, again, I'll give another spoiler alert. It turns out that like eating local is not really better for the climate.
What?
But we ended up having kind of an argument about, whether it is good for other things. The line that I used that really got Tamar mad was that I said, because she was sort of defending the community aspect of going to the farmer's market. And I said, it was just like going to a NASCAR race. It's kind of like like-minded white people. But which she did not like. But one thing I pointed out is that when I go to my farmer's market here in Miami, like, there's Driscoll raspberries there that they've flown in from California.
Oh, man.
And it's like, oh, great. And then at least the people in NASCAR races, they don't delude themselves that they're saving the planet.
I got two quick examples from the farmer's market I just went to 2 weeks ago. One was Olive Guy definitely wasn't making and marinating those olives. He was buying jars of olives and putting them in Tupperware. I'm sure of it. Number one. And number two, stuffed pepper guy, separate guy, like some Italian food restaurant kind of guy. 4 little stuffed peppers in a Tupperware thing. And I was like, oh, I love those. I'm definitely getting those. I'm happy to, pay a couple extra bucks. $12. I was like, there's 4 peppers. I like the first time ever, Mike, I asked about a thing from someone at a farmer's market and didn't buy it. I was like, oh, let me get let me get your card.
Well, look, I mean, especially for me, I come at this as, I come at the whole food issue from as a big part of the climate problem that we need to solve. And unfortunately, like, olives are not going to solve the climate problem. And, $12 goodies at the farmer's market definitely aren't going to solve the climate problem. And it turns out that, the transportation of getting your stuff to the market is really, it's less than 10% of the emissions anyway. What really matters is like what you eat, how much you waste, and how it's made, which isn't necessarily made in a better way by your local farmer. It just isn't.
Right, exactly. All right, give me one more topic or episode or thing you have explored or you want to explore on Climavores.
Oh, gosh, we did. I mean, we have an episode in the can about fake meat. We did one about vertical farming and indoor farming, which a lot of people are excited about as, kind of, these controlled environments where, you can, instead of having a crop, every 6 months, you have a crop every 2 weeks. And, there's no droughts or floods inside, and you don't waste any fertilizer. And so there's a lot of excitement, although you can probably tell from the way I'm introducing it, it turns out to, not be like a climate solution either, like maybe for lettuce, but not for food. Although there are really interesting twists to vertical farming too, where it turns out that the things we learn from vertical farms may end up help making outdoor farming a lot better. So I just think, this stuff, food is interesting. It's like everybody, people think about it all the time. Yeah. And the climate is, I think it's interesting. I know not everybody is as interested in the climate as I am, but this is a good planet. It's the only planet with pizza and reliable Wi-Fi. And so I think it's kind of important for us to try to do what we can to keep it habitable. Since our food is kind of a third of that problem, and beyond that, energy, we know what the problem is, right? It's like simple. It's like we got to stop using fossil fuels. We've got to electrify our economy, and then we've got to use zero emissions electricity. And then I don't want to make it sound like that's going to be easy to do. It's going to be really hard to do, and like millions of lives depend on how fast we do it. But we've sort of started to do it a little bit, and at least we definitely know know the path. Food, we don't even know what the questions are. Like food is a really, it's still, we haven't figured it out. We have barely started to try to address it. So it feels like a really good time to, dive in.
And who better to do it than you two? It's a great idea. It's a great podcast. Everybody that listens to this show will love it. Mike's been joining me for years. I was so excited to hear that you were launching it. And when I saw that you were partnering with Tamar, I was like, oh my God, this is going to be great. If they can figure this out, this is great. Last thing I want to mention to you, and one of the best compliments I think I got about doing this show over the years was years ago when someone said, wow, I can't believe you made composting interesting. And it was the strength of my guest, of course, but as always, I just saw for the first time the Lumi, and it is a tabletop composter. Have you ever heard of it? Lomi?
Yeah. And
it turns food scraps into soil, and it's $500, so it's only available to the rich.
Yeah.
But I mean, you got to plug it in. You plug it in to turn your food into scraps, and I'm wondering, as cool as that would be, especially for people who might live in urban areas, does that sound crazy to you, that device?
I mean, look.
Are you gonna take a hot Grunwald all over this idea?
People want to feel like they're helping, and I support that. I think I don't want to shit on people who want to feel like they're doing the right thing. But if you're really worried about your diet, the most important things you can do is eat less beef and waste less food, because wasting food wastes all the land and the fertilizer and the pesticides and the labor and the water and everything else that goes into growing it. And then beyond that, anything you do is a bonus. If you compost, that's great. If you have to use energy to do the composting, that's probably not as good as just sticking it in your garden. Look, I shouldn't speak to it, because one of the things we do pride ourselves on is we do the research, and I have not researched the Lomi. But I think the difference between big ticket items and small ticket items does matter a lot. And I think people want to know this stuff. I hope. Well, rather than, there's this idea that, sometimes people just want to feel good or feel like they're supporting the kind of farms that they assume are good. So we are going to, maybe prick some balloons on that, but hopefully people want the information and not just ammunition.
So happy that you're doing this. Really excited about it. I've subscribed and will be listening every week to Climavores, and I hope everybody listening to this podcast will as well. Mike, it's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. Continue to do excellent work, and now with Tamar, it's awesome. I'm very, very excited about this. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Pete. Keep up the great work.
All right, there you go, Mike Grunwald. Go listen to Climavores at Climavores Pod and tell Mike that you heard him here on Stand Up with Pete. Okay, and now it's time to get to my second guest. That's right, I've got two on this week off show day. We'll see if I have anything left for tomorrow. But everybody knows Ken Davis. He's my favorite historian. Don'tKnowMuch.com. Go get all of his books. Go read and follow him on Twitter, by the way, at Kenneth C. Davis. And we wanted to talk a little bit about Independence Day and more. We caught up last week just after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so it was a somber tone, but we always have a great conversation. I always learn so much from Ken, and I think you will too. So I'm just going to press play right now on my conversation with Kenneth C. Davis.
All right. What a privilege it is to talk with Kenneth C. Davis again in just 2 weeks. And man, do people love you on the show. They always love when you join. We always learn a lot. And of course, I am so grateful to you for joining me here just before Independence Day weekend at the end of June 2022. We have him back, Kenneth C. Davis. Thank you, sir.
Hey, Pete, it's great to talk to you. Thank you. I see the tweets after I'm on, and it's always very gratifying, of course, because when I talk to you, I think, oh, I'm talking to Pete. And I don't really think too much about the audience out there, but I know they exist, and I appreciate them, and I appreciate all the nice things they often say about our conversations. We talk about history because it matters. We talk about history because we cannot understand the past. I should say we can't understand the present without understanding the past. And right now, here in America, it seems like understanding the past is more important than ever, because the country has really been thrown into such turmoil in the past couple of years. It's been a long time coming. I don't think that this is the result of anything that's happened in the last year or 2 or 6 years, for that matter. This is a long-term revolution in some ways in our country. And we were moving in one very clear direction for a long time, slowly, painfully moving in that direction.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has clearly been reversed in the last a couple of years.
How would you describe the direction that the country was moving in for a long time?
Well, I think that, I wrote Don't Know Much About History, the first book that kind of established my place in this space of talking about history and how it matters to America today. I wrote that more than 30 years ago, and it was at the moment at which the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Berlin Wall was coming down, apartheid had been defeated around the same time, not all exactly, but it was this extraordinary, bright, shining moment where it seemed like the forces of democracy, human rights, people power, not only in America but around the world, had really won the day. People even talked about a famous writer, historian, wrote about the end of history as if this was some transformative moment. And here we are, a little more than 30 years later than that, and I feel so much of that has really fallen apart. Autocracies are on the rise around the world. We are watching this extraordinarily terrible war initiated by one of the most brutal autocrats of our time, Vladimir Putin. Of course, the war in Ukraine has sort of slipped below the fold on the newspaper, but I watch it daily because it's really an extraordinary moment. We've seen authoritarianism rise in many places around the world, and now we've had these hearings going on in Washington about the January 6th insurrection, which was clearly, I think the evidence is showing day by day, an orchestrated attempt to overthrow an election in this country. And the Congress is basically saying this. So the committee is certainly saying that. On top of that, we have these series of rulings from the Supreme Court in the past few weeks that really strike at the heart of some of the things that I certainly consider settled law, as all of these justices talked about it in their hearings. They're all going, ha, 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 we fooled you on that one, didn't we? So we saw a major reversal on state support of religion a few weeks ago. We saw a major decision upending the ability of states to legislate gun laws. And now, of course, we have the overthrow of Roe v. Wade with a concurring opinion by Justice Clarence Thomas that says, well, now we should go back and look at Griswold and Obergefell. Now, many people in your audience may not know what that refers to. Griswold refers to contraception. It's a decision that allowed contraception in this country. The other one is Obergefell, and that is the decision permitting same-sex marriage. So this is more than abortion. And I know a lot of people on many ends of the spectrum have different feelings about abortion, but we're talking about rights that had been established for a long time. I mean, I didn't hear Justice Thomas mention it, but the same ideas could go into overturning Loving versus Virginia, the ruling that ended laws against interracial marriage in this country. Ironically, of course, Clarence Thomas is a black man married to a white woman. He could not have done that legally in Virginia before 1965. So these are really, really times that are trying democracy. I'm reminded of Thomas Paine, who wrote back in the American Revolution, "These are the times that try men's souls." And I think we are really seeing that the soul of democracy is being tried at this moment, which is why I think it is so important to talk about and understand what happened on July 4th, 1776, what those men, and they were all men, were trying to do, what they accomplished, and what we should take away from it nearly 250 years later.
The Declaration, also well said, and such a great setup for the rest of the conversation about July 4th, 1776, and the Declaration of Independence, which is what I wanted to read from. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." And I could go on, but one of the issues, and certainly this is for, a constitutional law scholar to debate, and I do want to ask the historian on the Declaration of Independence is, number one, what they meant by independence, when the unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also why 9 unelected, lifetime appointed judges would be deciding on these unalienable rights instead of the people's representatives in their legislative bodies at the state and national level. And that's obviously the issue for a lot of us, that a bunch of men, or in this case, one woman as well, decided on the rights of women and not what Congress has to say. And you could say that about voting rights as well. The Supreme Court overturned the vast, something that the Senate approved entirely in 2006, every senator. So, pick up on any of that in terms of history, what the founders meant by it all, and how it's being interpreted by these judges.
Yeah, these are huge questions, obviously. And so I'm going to try and I'll stick to July 4th a little bit, because July 4th has nothing to do with, of course, establishing the Supreme Court. That came about 11 years later with the ratification of the United States Constitution, with its 3 separate branches of government, a very key idea to many of these founders. But let's go back and just do some of the basics of the Declaration of Independence. First of all, just get some dates out of the way. April 19th, 1775, a full year before, the war had actually already begun, the war with England, the war for independence, with the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill had already taken place in Boston proper. A young man, not so young at this point, George Washington, had been appointed about a year before by this same Continental Congress to take over this ragtag army that was on the hills overlooking Boston, based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Washington had gone up there to take charge of an army that was really bedraggled. Yet he did something extraordinary in fending off the British for the next series of years. So a year later, war is going on. I mentioned the words of Thomas Paine. These are the times that try men's souls. Earlier in 1776, he had written the famous pamphlet anonymously called Common Sense, which explained the reasons why America should be independent of its colonial master, the Great Britain. And this was the question that was being debated in June of 1776 in Philadelphia by these men who, and they were all men, of course, who had gathered together. They were not all of one mind at first about splitting off from Great Britain. They had tried and tried again to send what they call olive branches. There had been a letter called the Olive Branch Petition to try and get King George to relent on some of these things. There were people who wanted to remain colonists. Most people in the 13 colonies, most white people in the 13 colonies at that time were first and second generation Americans. Many of them were English by birth, although there were Germans and Irish in large numbers as well. It was primarily an Anglo-American 13 colonies. And so there was tremendous feeling to stay connected to England. Many Americans had relatives back in England or family back in England, including George Washington. So this was not a slam dunk by any means for those who wanted independence, but they were moving towards this. And on July 2nd, an actual resolution declaring America or saying that America was independent was passed by the Continental Congress. John Adams was so thrilled by this. John Adams, of course, one of the important delegates from Massachusetts, went home that night and wrote to his wife, Abigail. They had this wonderful exchange of letters between them. He writes back, and you've probably seen the HBO series. It's
that's how I know. That's how I know about it. Yeah,
it's a pretty good presentation of their lovely relationship. And Adams writes back to Abigail saying, July 2nd will go down in history. We'll be celebrating with parades and bonfires and illuminations, kind of fireworks, because he thought that this day would go down as the day that America declared its independence. But 2 days later, Congress adopts Jefferson's declaration, not as he had drafted it, and we'll come back to that. And it really is Jefferson's declaration, which is read in public a few days later, published and sent around to the rest of the colonies, states, by this point, now that they had declared their independence, that this explanation really becomes the birth certificate and the true birthday of the nation. So by rights, we should be celebrating from July 2nd to July 4th, a kind of permanent 3-day holiday, but that's not going to happen. But this is the sort of the third leg in the triple crown of historic holidays that we talk about at this time of year. Memorial Day, rooted in the Civil War, with very clear connections to slavery. Juneteenth, which we celebrated officially a few weeks ago for the first time, and now the 4th of July. These three holidays really do emphasize what America stood for and should stood for, and the tremendous sacrifices that have been made over nearly 250 years to win those rights. So Jefferson writes this document, and I'll come back to your very good questions about what some of these things mean. He writes the document. He's part of a committee. 5 men are actually on the committee. They include John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. They make a few suggestions to Jefferson. Franklin, I think, specifically suggested substituting pursuit of happiness to the original, which was pursuit of property. We can come back to that one as well. And Jefferson then turns this draft version over to the full Congress. They sit and pick it apart for 2 years, and Jefferson was not happy about it. Like most writers, he thought his words were perfectly fine as he wrote them. So that then becomes the document that is sent off to the printer, and it's printed in a broadsheet that's sent all over the country, and some copies are sent to Great Britain. And also a calligrapher is then assigned to write a parchment, a handwritten parchment version, which is not actually signed by most of the delegates until August. So when we talk about the July 4th and the signing of the Declaration, all those fancy signatures, including John Hancock's, were not done on July 4th. That happened much later. The Declaration was adopted on July 4th, 1776. So that's the sort of background to that story.
I don't think we've talked about this before. I'm sure maybe I've read it in your writing, but I don't think I knew most of that. Huh. All right.
Most of us don't. I mean, we read this thing, and generally when we read the Declaration, we only read the preamble, some of the words you read, and then stop before Jefferson gets to this long list of charges against the King of England to explain why America should be free from his tyranny. And a lot of that is flat out propaganda. But one of those charges was in Jefferson's draft version, and it was deleted by the Congress. And this is an important one. Jefferson wrote a long paragraph excoriating the King of England for slavery. He said the King of England was responsible for slavery, and he was keeping Americans from ending slavery, which was completely untrue. This is flat out propaganda. Yes, the Declaration has some propaganda in it. Anti-British propaganda, but that's not all propaganda is necessarily bad. It's propaganda. It's to propagate the faith. So Jefferson writes this paragraph talking about slavery, and Congress basically says, no, we're not going there. This is one of the only pieces of Jefferson's draft that was deleted. All the other changes Congress made, and there were several, were really word changes here and there. They introduced a lot more of the references to the supreme being, providence, the creator, not specifically mentioning a Christian God, but more of a deist version of a supreme power that was driving this. Jefferson, of course, was not that crazy about religion himself, but he went along with it because that was the only way it was going to get passed. So they did sign off on this declaration, but took out any reference to slavery. And this is a reminder that 56 men eventually signed the Declaration of Independence. At least 40 of them, 40 by my count, were slaveholders or invested in the slave trade. And slavery existed in all of the 13 original states. There was no state that did not have slavery. Pennsylvania, where they passed this, was the first state to end slavery, but not for a few more years. So this is the essential contradiction. You might call it a hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence, that these men who are talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal, were all heavily invested in slavery, and it certainly wasn't mentioned in the Declaration, nowhere mentioned, and is not mentioned 11 years later in the Constitution, but plays a central role in the founding and development of the United States of America. And anyone who tries to think otherwise, or tell you otherwise, or have schools teach anything other than that is teaching nonsense. And that's why this is an important issue that I bring up all the time. America was certainly conceived in liberty, as Abraham Lincoln put it, but it was also born in shackles. And until we all learn that, accept it, and understand how that past and how that historical truth has carried down 250 odd years later, we are not going to really understand what is at the root of racism in this country.
Indeed, and so important. What about some of the radical new, profound ideas were stated in the Declaration of Independence?
Okay, this is an important one also because Thomas Jefferson didn't sit down and come up with these ideas by himself over the course of a few weeks, sitting in Philadelphia, working on by the way, he was working on a small portable desk. I love this kind of story.
Yeah,
working on a small portable desk that he had designed himself. He took the design to a carpenter in Philadelphia and had it made. It was a desk, because he was writing with a quill, that has a slanted top. You can actually see it. It's at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. You can see it online. It's in their treasures. And this was essentially, not to be glib or silly about it, the first laptop. He wrote on a laptop desk. And that was how the Declaration kind of comes into being. But what he was writing was the result of more than 100 years of thinking and philosophy and radical changes in the perception of human rights, law, religion that we call the Enlightenment. This was the so-called Age of Reason. And around the world, but particularly in Europe, you had people like Voltaire and Rousseau, and I could go down the list of these very important French philosophers, others in England, John Locke, who were tremendously influential to Thomas Jefferson and other founders, like Adams and certainly Benjamin Franklin. So these ideas that the divine right of kings was, poppycock, and that the church ruled supreme. No. Men have a right to, men, I use that in the sense that Jefferson was using it at the time. People have a right to think about things for themselves. This was upsetting hundreds, if not thousands of years of church teaching as well as hereditary monarchy, and introducing the idea that Jefferson puts into words. And what the brilliance of it is the perfection of the words Jefferson uses. So he does say that this is an inalienable. He wrote inalienable. The printer changed it to unalienable. There's been some debate about that. Is there any difference? I don't think. Unalienable rights. It means that nobody can take these away from you. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was a phrase that had been used earlier by others, and I mentioned the phrase as Jefferson heard it and first used it was the pursuit of property, meaning that the church and the king didn't own everything, which is what people thought at that time. Part of the problem with using the word property was that it implied human property by 1776. And so Franklin may have suggested to Jefferson that he change it to happiness. And obviously, when he's writing Pursuit of Happiness, he's not writing about happiness like a puppy or puppies and unicorns. He's writing about happiness in the sense of achieving a state of full self-realization, we might call it today in more psychological terms. And it's not a guarantee of happiness, but the right to pursue happiness, that each of us is entitled to that. And so this was a very, very radical departure from a world in which kings and popes essentially ruled, and popes, and in England now, the ruler was also the head of the church as well as the head of the state. The king was the head of the Church of England, so had the same kind of divine power in many respects that a pope had. The men like Jefferson understood the dangers of that. And I think we talked about this when we talked about the ruling about the First Amendment, that these guys feared religion being a way to dictate what people should do and must do. And that's why it's so important to realize that freedom of thought, freedom of religion were such powerful ideas to this man. And then he finally says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This was, of course, a completely radical idea. Of course, there had been republics before, there had been democracies before. Most of them had ended badly. A lot of the founding fathers, Jefferson, Washington, certainly, others really looked to the Roman Republic as this idealized version of what a democracy should be. Men of great power and influence and who had the intellectual capacity and the wealth to make wise decisions for everybody else, would still have to rely upon people giving them their votes. So this was, again, at a time when most countries in the world were ruled by hereditary monarchs, or in the case of other places, the sway of the church was so powerful. So that's why these ideas are so important, and they have survived the test of time, as far as I'm concerned, in spite of the glaring contradictions that the men who were writing these words and then promised and pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to these ideas, that was not a words they were taking lightly. If caught, they would have probably been hung as traitors. A couple of them were caught and put in jail, but never suffered too much for what they had done. But certainly, this was treason against the most powerful man on earth at the time, the King of England. So you didn't sign such a document lightly. And John Hancock has been, sort of egotistically mocked for signing his handwriting in such big letters. He supposedly said at the time, "There, the king won't need his spectacles to read that." But these men did actually. It actually probably was more that Hancock wanted to put himself in the center of this little galaxy of men, and they all had to then sign their names in much smaller writing around the margins. A little bit of, the reminder that these were guys who had egos, ambitions, and were interested in themselves. One could imagine, politicians of our own time wanting to sign such a document in a very large, pronounced scrawl.
Ken, what was the reaction of Americans to the Declaration of Independence? How does this thing get out there? Did they just tweet it out and let everybody know? Did Lester Holt read it on the nightly news, or did everybody get was it handed out in a stone tablet month by month?
None of those, none of the above, we can say. It
I'm not a
was
historian.
read in public the very next day in Philadelphia, read to cheers by all accounts. Cheers and church bells ringing. The Liberty Bell did not crack when it was rung for the Declaration of Independence. It really was cracked much later and had to do more with abolition in Pennsylvania than with the actual Declaration. But that's just more of the mythology we have about the Liberty Bell and this whole period. By the way, anybody, we can be cynical about all this stuff, but I love it. And I love to go to Philadelphia. I love to go and see the Liberty Bell. You go and see the site of Washington's house there. And they explain, yes, he was here. He kept slaves here, but he still did these extraordinary things. This is where they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They came back 11 years later and wrote the U.S. Constitution. These are powerful things. And I think that I can certainly be sarcastic, perhaps, without being too cynical. But I think that, I really marvel that these men, for all their flaws, shortcomings, and contradictions, produced this document and later the Constitution that has really survived the test of time until recently. As many of the congressmen who have been speaking on the January 6th Commission have said, we have had more than 200 years of free and fair elections for the most part, with the peaceful transfer of power. The one time there was a real question about it was back in 1800, and Jefferson was involved, but it was resolved peacefully. And John Adams didn't hang around for Jefferson's inauguration, but neither did he complain about it. So this is really part of an American tradition that is important and valuable, that we have had a true working, somewhat creaky, somewhat fractured imperfect democracy, but that's part of the slow, agonizingly slow process of improving it that I've talked about. And so I think we don't want to get too cynical about American history and throw out some extraordinary truths.
Right. And it's why you're my favorite historian, because you mix it all up. In your first book that I read, Don't Know Much About History, Everything You Need to Know About History, but Never Learned. It's exactly how you document it. It's not just history written by the winners. It's not just, the people's history, Howard Zinn, which is written more by the losers, I suppose. But it's not too cynical, and it's got a lot of humor in it as well. I always love reading your work, but also, of course, talking to you because of the nuance that you include in it. I don't know what else to ask you about Independence Day. I know I got to let you go, but I wonder how history and historians will see January 6th, because I have a hard time understanding how it's a debatable point that for the first time we did not have a peaceful transition of power. There was a violent insurrection during the transition period that tried to prevent certification of the election. It was violent. It wasn't peaceful. But maybe I'm missing something. How do you see how history should see the period between the election and the inauguration?
Certainly, as the most, the history, how it will be written really depends on what happens in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years, I suppose. If Tiananmen Square, which happened 30 years ago, had resulted in a massive public uprising against the Chinese government, resulting in its downfall, we would have that story in the Chinese history books. But that didn't happen. Right. So the Chinese history books now don't reflect the fact that there was an uprising and a demonstration of massive numbers of people, many of whom were killed in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. So I think, 30 years from now, how will January 6th be recorded really will depend on who's writing. History is great for trying to understand the present. It's much less useful in predicting the future. We have clearly, the evidence is being presented. It seems clear to me that this was an organized conspiracy to prevent the acknowledged, accepted will of the American people from being carried out. That's as dangerous in American history as Mussolini's march on Rome was in 1922, or Hitler's failed putsch was a decade later. Both of those events eventually led to the rise of fascist and Nazi governments in those countries.
Right.
So I don't know where we're going.
No, that's a great answer and a great point. It depends on what happens in the next few years, and the examples that you just gave, China. And,
I would just say one more point without getting too much into the politics of what's happening right now. The events leading up to January 6th couldn't have happened without a long history of an attempt, and this ties into the Supreme Court, a long history of very, very organized attempts to control voting in the American states, to control the legislatures in American states. And that has been a very successful kind of unwatched movement. The fact that these states are now even talking about the idea that state legislatures could determine which slate of electors to send to Congress is a daunting idea. And you also had people who have been rightly applauded for the things that they did on or before January 6th, who are still saying, yeah, but I'd vote for the guy if he ran again tomorrow. That to me is a really, really dangerous idea, and I don't know how we get away from that.
The needle to thread there is, listen, I'm not going to do anything illegal for that guy, but I would vote for him. I'm not gonna go burn down the house he just told me to burn down, but I'll still support him because most of the stuff he's done, I agree with and support.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous moment for the Republic, for democracy, not only here but around the world. Because look, for 30 years, for better or for worse, the United States was leading the charge in talking about democracy, at least putting on a good show, doing some very, very valuable, important things. I've written, for instance, about the Marshall Plan, this extraordinary expenditure of what was a lot of money back then to rebuild the broken countries of Europe after World War II. Without a question, the most successful foreign policy decision made in American history, I think, certainly right up there. Because it created a group of healthy, thriving democracies in a completely war-destroyed Europe that eventually becomes the European Union, NATO, the European Union, the counterbalance to the Soviet Union. And that piece of foreign policy changed history. And so we are still considered the leaders of the free world, and if that changes, if that goes down, I really don't know where we go. So I'm an optimistic person, but I'm probably as pessimistic as I've ever been in my life right now. So on this 4th of July, where we're thinking about all these very grave issues, I still say, these are important ideas and they are worth fighting for. Would you give up your honor, your sacred honor, your fortune, and your life for these ideals, as these 56 guys did back in 1776?
So well said, and a great place to end it. I am so grateful that we have you to help us interpret the history, and as we see it unfolding right now, the present. Kenneth C. Davis, always a pleasure, and forever in your debt. Thank you from myself and everybody listening. We love you, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Go pursue happiness.
On it.
All right, that is it. What did you think? I hope that you liked it. This has been my week off broadcast, so I guess not too much different than my week on, but maybe a little shorter, maybe a little less emphasis on the intros and stuff. I don't know, but I hope you liked it. I hope you appreciated it, and let Kenneth C. Davis and Mike Grunwald know that you did. If you don't mind, give the podcast a review. That kind of thing matters on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The more reviews, the more likely people are to hear about the podcast. And join us, standupwithpete.com, standupwithpete.com. For as little as $5 a month, you can support the work and all of the amazing guests that we learn from each day, build our community, meet more people, and know that you're never alone if you're part of it. All right, speaking of which, John Carroll, would you mind taking us out, my brother? I'll talk to you tomorrow. Be the change you want to see in the world. Love you guys. Bye.
Sunlight, you gotta stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You gotta stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear and all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all they had. stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for loss, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up. We got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up. You got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up. Stand up. Got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up. People got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Stand